to the Kolbecast, episode 237. Thank you for joining us. Today, Bonnie and I are joined by Kolbe instructor and homeschooling mom, Leslie Spencer. A teacher of almost 30 years, our conversation takes on the tone of a world adventure, from teaching in Japan to living in a yurt, to investigating bones of the ancient Greeks and more. Even if you never leave home, Leslie explains how homeschooling and science are all about discovery and discoveries that lead us to loving God and our neighbor. We hope that you'll enjoy the show.
Hi there, I'm Bonnie, Kolbe homeschooling mom of 4 lads and lasses, liturgical musician, popcorn, and podcast fanatic.
And this is Stephen, homeschooling father of 5 and chief homeschooling officer for Kolbe Academy.
Joining us today is a longtime member of the Kolbe Academy family. She currently teaches high school science courses in our online academy. Mrs. Leslie Spencer, welcome to the Kolbecast.
Hi, thank you so much.
Many of our listeners will know you, but for those who do not yet, will you tell us about yourself and your Kolbe connection, homeschooling experience, so forth?
Yeah, I started teaching at Kolbe quite some time ago. My memory tells me it's 1995, but even that, I don't keep records at this point, so I'm not really sure.
Okay.
We moved to California, about in 1994, I think, and I wasn't working at Kolbe at the time. I just came on, when there was a need, and the need was for a science teacher. I'm a graduate of the University of Dallas. Before that, I'd been teaching at a Catholic school in Japan. Again, it's a little different, was different. Things were different before the internet. We could stay in touch with occasional phone calls or occasional letters or something like that across the Pacific. But it's not like it is now. I can go to their website now, and I realize, wow, not only did I get older, but so did all the young sisters who were teaching back then, but it's easy to communicate now. It wasn't, for a long time. So that too was a great experience. It was part of what I brought to Kolbe was everything that came from going to the University of Dallas, which was just, one of those things where I think that was like one of those chances where you're given a moment of grace and you say, wow, yes. And it worked out. It was, there are probably many, many more that we all have just ignored or turned away from, but there's just a couple times where something came along. I had never heard of the University of Dallas, but that was where I was born, actually. As a matter of fact, my mom had been to the obstetrician and was going to see President Kennedy with my dad on the day he was shot in Dallas. So I didn't even know that until long after my dad passed away. Nobody had ever told me that I was actually there, But so I had ties to Dallas, and I found this school, and I thought this is everything I want in an education, and I've never seen or heard anything like this. I had looked at a couple schools similar. So I went there. I loved it. I loved being able to learn a wide variety of things. And that's something I try to bring into our Kolbe classes. It's not always doable, right? It depends on the class. I think physics is one of the last sciences they take, and it's one of the best ones to bring in history, art, music, because all those things come into it, and to kind of give them a sense of the scope of what human beings have done. With chemistry, a lot of times I focus on be amazed that anybody figured out fire, much less how to get metal out of rocks and then do stuff with it. It's crazy. But with, just all those different things that you're required to take at the University of Dallas came into what I wanted to see in a lesser way at Kolbe. And some of the things that were already there at Kolbe, already in place, the idea of having a Greek, Rome, medieval, modern year, that's exactly what the kind of stuff we had. So I knew it was a great fit when I came to Kolbe. And I was also really pleased to be able to have experienced not just the University of Dallas, which was different from what I'd grown up with, but being Catholic in Japan. It was a and Maximilian Kolbe, as you know, Father Kolbe went to Saint Maximilian Kolbe, excuse me, went to Nagasaki back, when Nagasaki before the war, right? And then eventually he went back home, and the whole, of course, was killed and all of that. But there are connections, and I just felt like there's something here I have to pursue, you know. So I enjoyed being part of something that was pushing back against what had been education throughout most of my life, which was moving toward the more progressive stuff that parents are often rightly skeptical of or even object to, because some of it is downright objectionable, right? So, this going back to this kind of education was very exciting. I feel like I should have interesting stories since we're talking, and I'm not sure that I have any. I taught for a week in rural China, living in a yurt with nomads back in that time that I lived in Japan. I went some of my summer to China. Like Tim Walls, actually. I mean, I don't want to get political on, but it's about that same period, right? Where China was suddenly, after years, before the rise of technology, there was a time when they were slowly bringing down those walls, letting people in that had never been in. Now, in the Soviet Union, the whole thing collapsed. In China, they kind of hung on and stayed with their more totalitarian regime, and now they have technology to kind of enforce things. But I had this great experience of going places where a lot of people had never met an American, and just being able to talk with people. I had been warned before I went by a lot of, Mary Knoll's sisters actually, don't just leave, to be very cautious, with the religion, because you can get people arrested if the Chinese authorities think that you're trying to push it. But what I found was how interesting it was that was what people wanted to talk to me about. I mean, I'm just an American, right? But it's like, do you believe in Christ was one of the most common questions I got. And it was an insight into what was going on. And it was also really cool to live in this traditional yurt, with, it was a giant tent, oriental carpets, and a central wood-fired stove, but also a television. And parents who were committed to their children and knew that if their children learned English, they would have a chance to get out of the system, to perhaps work for a foreign company, maybe even go abroad to work, that was a really big hope for them. And being able to just be part of that was really exciting. So that was part of what I relied on as we were looking at some of the stuff we brought into the Kolbe curriculum about trying to we wanted to emphasize our own cultural heritage, but at the same time, we also want our students to be aware of things outside it, things in Asia or Africa or whatever. And I think when there's a way you can do that where it's very healthy, and then there's a way you can do it where it sort of undermines your own society. And so it was just really, really an honor to be there when Kolbe was just still getting going, and deciding what direction everything was going to take. I think the people who founded Kolbe that I knew were the Muths and the Crotties. I know that there's another family, and I apologize for not remembering their names, but I never met them. But those four people have my unending admiration for what they did, in being persistent and starting first a little school, in understanding how we were going to, turn it into a homeschool, do it by mail. And then just as we got there, there was this rise of the internet, and getting Kolbe online at that time was a big deal. And it eventually grew into this whole online school, which is just amazing to me.
I remember one of my boys mentioning the yurt when they were in one of your classes, and I was like, that just kind of stopped me in my tracks. Like, hold on, did he just say what I thought he said? Like, did she lived in a yurt? I've read about these and seen these. Like, wow, that's amazing. So,
Yes,
yeah,
this is like the Chinese. I mean, Kazakhstan is former Soviet Republic, but part of it's kind of like Mongolia and Inner Mongolia. You know, there are parts of China which are that culturally the Kazakhs. So it's the same culture. I know that if my own children did it, I would be out of my head with worry. I think that's one of the advantages of not being online in those days, you know. It's like, well, it's summer vacation. I think I'll do this. You know, I hear that they're looking for English teachers. I'll take a train across China and then I'll pop in and hang out and just, you know, for some people, that's just how they live. But for most of us in the United States, the idea of being, you know, a seasonal nomad, of, you know, going up the mountain in summer and coming down to the valley in winter, and with your whole moving your house, your flocks, you know, your extended family and friends. I mean, that's a lot of people throughout history have lived that way. And it was a unique privilege to be invited in to share it with them, you know.
yeah, amazing. And so great hearing about Kolbe's founders too. Um, is there more you want to say about them? Any stories that you remember, or
I wish I
things
had
that you?
more stories. I know I often lean on a prayer to the Holy Spirit that to open class that Mr. Crotty actually asked us to open classes with. And it's a funny thing because it goes way back to, you know, early 20th century, late 19th. So no, I think the guy had the person who wrote it, I shouldn't say guy, I think he's a priest, you know, but it's one of those people who's like really famous at the time. You know, the longer you live, the more you can suddenly say, oh yeah, I remember so and so. He was a big deal for a minute and then he's not, right? Well, this priest composed this prayer to the Holy Spirit. This is maybe even I've you know very very early, and you know, and I remember when we were told, you know, this is how we're going to open all the classes. I thought, well, this is weird. I've never heard this, but Mr. Crotty was passing on something that he knew from his early days, you know, and it's nice to keep uh, that that alive. So I do that a lot. There's that particular prayer. Father Rutler wrote an article about it a few years back, you know, just saying, you may not know this. And um, it's just sort of interesting. You know, history hits the highlights, but there are a lot of people who live and contribute to life that we don't know about. And even if you're famous or internet famous as people are now, you know, for a little bit, you're likely to be eventually somewhat forgotten. But it's nice to be able to pass something on, you know.
Mhm, for sure.
I've been hearing about the Voyager space probes, and I know that those launched when I was a kid, not terribly, you know, middle school or so. And one of the things on it is a golden record. And on the golden record, you know, there's Bach, there's Chuck Berry, there's conversation in a bunch of languages, but there's also the sound of a horse-drawn cart. And it reminds me that my own dad, when he was a kid, he was born, you know, just at the beginning of the Depression. As he was growing up and going to school, a lot of times walking to school, he'd jump on the milk truck, which was a horse-drawn cart. The milkman would be glad to give the little kids, you know, going to school a little ride on the back of his cart. And that sound, which was so familiar to him and was familiar to the people who've sent this record out into space, you know, so that if there's anyone out there, any alien life out there, they could hear what life in on Earth sounds like. Um, Thought that was so important. Whereas very few of us, certainly none of us in the United States, are familiar with that. You know, there was a hayride uh, through, you know, rural New England that I saw. You know, that's the last time I saw a couple weeks ago. You know, people will bring it out for something like that, you know, Christmas or fall leaves turning. But you don't know. the day-to-day changes over the years.
Sure. Yep.
That brings to mind, I was talking, my grandmother had been born less than 100 years ago, but um, I would talk to her when she was older, asking her about developments in the world. I'm like, what was the greatest invention in your time, Grandma? And she said, well, the washing machine.
Oh
And
yeah.
I'm like,
Yeah.
wait, we've
Can
got computers?
confirm.
Yeah. Refrigeration, computers, but she's like, nope, the washing machine. It just changed our life when we didn't have to spend all day doing the wash. And it's good to kind of recognize that. And I love some of the earlier things like with chemistry. I taught a little chemistry and physics online for years, not recently, but just the process, like you said, of actually making iron tools is immensely complex and amazing, and we just take it for granted today. It's just like, oh yeah, it's all we've always had iron. It's easy.
Yeah. Yeah, it's your Bronze Age, right? No big deal.
Yeah.
No, there's a good reason it took a long time to get there. Yeah. And there's my grandfather was a chemistry professor up until World War II. He was an, and he went and did some war work when the war came. But before that, he was just a teacher, and I still have his chemistry textbook that he taught out of, and I'll bring it out and show the students. In it, the Lewis structure's kind of new, right? It's at the end of the book where we usually put stuff like relativity. They
Yeah.
have stuff like, well, it seems like maybe there's something going on with the electrons. And at that time the book was published, the neutron had not yet been discovered. So there's, radioactivity was toward the end of the book as well. And that kind of stuff, those changes are amazing. My grandparents were all four of my grandparents were born prior to Kitty Hawk and passed away after men had walked on the moon. So, quite a century in the last 100 years.
Yes.
Definitely. Yeah. So your name might be familiar to folks if they haven't had you as a teacher. Your name might still be familiar to them from a recent Kolbe Academy social media post.
Oh, yes, yes, yes.
You took a trip recently and shared some photos. So please tell us about that trip. I've got this fascination going with archaeology lately
I
and how it
forgot. That's
connects to
actually
our,
why we
yeah.
first got together. I was just sort of, yeah. It was sort of a side, I don't know, let's call it a side quest. It was a trip to Athens for work, but part of it involved this wonderful visit to a lab at the American School of Classical Studies in Athens. We had a chance to view all this stuff. And so there was an exhibit of Heinrich Schliemann's notebook where he is looking at Homer and considering where he might explore to find the remains of Troy, which he seems to have done. People have thoughts about him as an archaeologist. Maybe, he was a hero, and then he was a villain, and perhaps now we've kind of said, well, he's got mixed reviews. But he certainly took seriously the claims of people who lived in the past about their history, and it paid off. And so that was interesting. There were some of his sketches of the things he found. Later, we went to this archaeology lab at the American Classical School, different from their exhibits. And the things they can do are amazing. In the first place we visited, they were looking at bones, and the bones they were looking at were from the dawn of Athenian democracy. And we certainly talk about that at Kolbe. We've all, I hope, learned about Athenian democracy as part of the background of who we are as Americans. And I'm sorry if people are listening who are not Americans. Some of them might not be. There's Canadians, all sorts of people. We've had students from all over the world. But I think that revolution toward democracy and the Enlightenment, and look back to ancient Greece. Well, one of the things that they are exploring is how a lot of people happened to die right around that time. And through their studies of the bones, they find that these are wealthy people because you can tell what people eat from their bones. And were they convicted of rebelling against the new democracy? Were they fighting against it? Were they simply a bunch of rich people who got killed because their neighbors discovered they could do that, with impunity in this time of revolution? So it's an ongoing question, and they're hoping that some of their research will give insight into what happened. We read about it in Plutarch, but that's way after the fact. And the government of kings and powerful and influential people isn't going to give way to government that just happily hands over some of its power to the masses of people without there being some conflict. So they're trying to figure out what went on in just this one particular little site. So I thought that was kind of interesting.
Yeah.
The next table was even better. They were separating bone fragments. On one side, they had Spartans, on the other, Athenians. And again, from the fragments, because we read about the Spartans and their diet and the black broth and so on, the things that the Spartans eat and the minerals that are in their soil go into their food, go into their bones. So you can still tell a Spartan from an Athenian, even just in these little fragments. So they're analyzing it and also trying to see what they can learn from it. And so I thought that one was the one that just slayed me. It's like, wow, these little Tupperware boxes are brave Spartan warriors' remains, and over there, the Athenians. And then I think the final thing that I saw that was just blew me away was a very sophisticated electron microscope and X-ray microscopes, where at this point they can now take a fragment of pottery, look at it, and first pass at a certain level, they get a set of fingerprints. But the instrument is so precise, they can go through to the next layer of fingerprints, to the next layer. And actually, they were saying that they usually can make a pretty good guess as to who the artisan was because there's a final layer of fingerprints. Unless you've used it as a weapon and started, rubbing off fingerprints, that you don't think, you just handle it. So it was really cool. Again, I would never have guessed that they could do that, and I'm sure that there are a lot of times where they analyze stuff and it does just come up empty. But being able to say, oh, look, this has a fingerprint, this has a fingerprint, it looks like this person's workmanship. We think this is from this time, this place, by this man. And again, there's a guy who is totally forgotten, and yet there's a little mark that he left in history, and they're digging it up and looking at it. So I was just blown away. I enjoyed it. The Greek tour guides were always pleased when there's this light of recognition when they're talking about some of the people you think of when you think about founders of Greece, whether it's legendary like Theseus or someone like Solon. They're still looking at that. And again, you could say, well, it's just stories, right? No, there was obviously some foundation, and their looking into it was based on what they'd heard. And so, things pay off.
I think that's so fascinating. I love hearing you tell about it.
One of my kids who had a summer program where he got to be an archaeologist for the summer, and it was a blast. You find stuff people have never seen, not in thousands of years. So I was just a visitor, and just I'm recounting everything they're working on to the best of my recollection. So any errors in explaining it are totally mine, because I'm sure they'll be publishing work based on this over the next few years, 5 years, 10 years. So you heard it here first, but you might not have heard it in its final form.
Okay, we will stay tuned for that then. So it's things like this that I know my own kids have enjoyed being in your classes for reasons like this. You bring the subject matter to life in a way that really kind of captures their imagination and their interest. So you've been teaching high schoolers for a long time. What do you love about high schoolers teaching them and
I love the fact that high schoolers are getting to be adults. I mean, they're not necessarily adults with great judgment all the time because we've all met teenagers, but there's just this step into the adult world that they are making, and being able to relate to them without an extra filter. Like when you're talking to little kids, you want to make sure that they understand you. You're not, I don't like to talk down to young children. But at the same time, there's a change in vocabulary when you're talking to another adult versus a kid. I think by the time they're even in middle school, you can really begin to just use whatever words you like. And even if they don't know it, they can just kind of guess, helps them expand their universe versus, just talking in the most simplistic manner possible. And being able to talk about a lot of things, even if they don't necessarily know them. I don't know where all the students come from. I don't know their backgrounds. And at any online class, there's usually a student who's a first year at Kolbe, a student who has been homeschooled for life, a student who's been in the online school for life. There's all these variations on it. And so we don't necessarily have a common framework. So if I'm talking about Sparta and Athens, or if I'm talking about Venice versus Constantinople in terms of where you might find the bones of Saint Nicholas because of the fall and of the Byzantine Empire and things like that. I don't know that they know what I'm talking about, but it's helping to fill out their world and their worldview. And I think that's something that we had in our culture when I was growing up. I don't see as much of it. I mean, certainly we had a musical like Hamilton, but it would not be the references in our pop culture in the middle of the 20th century were very broad. You could have Rembrandt, Snoopy's doghouse burned down and he lost his Van Gogh. Uh, and people understanding kind of who Van Gogh is. Well, he was on Doctor Who recently, so maybe not, well, recently, perhaps even 10 years ago. But it was, the things that hold us together, I think, were better than, just a bigger group of things that we could take as a common culture. And maybe that's just the difference between broadcast media tying us together versus the new media kind of letting us find our own affinity groups. So I enjoy talking to them. I enjoy sharing things with them. I don't mind challenging them by throwing something out there. They might not have any idea what I'm talking about, but they'll pick it up. I don't do that with the actual academic work. I do try to explain that. I enjoy giving them some responsibilities and freedom, telling them that they're moving into this adult world, and I understand they have jobs, they have important sports events, they have because there's being a high school senior on a team is a big deal, and a lot of our students may not, they may be taking an online class or entirely homeschool, but they might be participating in the varsity football team or baseball team. They're going to be taking college visits. And so I like to, put it on them. I'm happy to work with you, but you have to let me know. There's always some students who are very uncomfortable reaching out to adults and don't, would not want to do that. So trying to make it possible for them to start to interact with older people as peers is great, because that's what they're going to be doing for the rest of their life. If they're working in a job, they'll have, or anywhere else, you're when you're in school, you're often only, and this is, less true of a homeschooler, but it's still true. you tend to hang around with people who are your age, almost exactly. And then you graduate into the adult world, and suddenly somebody who's 30 years older is working next to you, and you have to kind of learn to get along. So I love the fact that high schoolers they're just about to step into, adult life. It's fascinating to see what they're going to do. I'm so happy when I can support them. We've had so many people doing interesting things who are homeschooling or no, online schooling, maybe because they're working something like they're working as a young actor. I know we had one who was doing a lot of commercials and the occasional bit part in a sitcom, and he would be doing his online schooling where he could, and that's great. They've got some ideas about where they want to go or what they want to do. Some of them have no ideas, but they're all just sort of like on the cusp of doing something, making decisions, following distinct paths. So that's a nice part of teaching high schoolers. They also, of course, I shouldn't, they do have their issues with coming to terms with the emotional life. That can be a really heavy burden for a lot of them. And I often try to know what's going on. I think that we try to work with parents. I think the greatest thing about Kolbe is I think our staff, like our deans, like Elizabeth Hoxie and Kelly Powers, they're constantly, stepping in to help parents with how their kids are doing. As a teacher, I'm more focused on what we're here to talk about, which is usually physics or chemistry. But I can see when things are going on. And I've just learned so much, even in these last years. Whatever they say about old dogs and new tricks, no, I'm still learning stuff. Just how they deal with really difficult situations, whether they're externally difficult situations like illness in the family, or the kind of internally difficult situations where students are just just not able, just deeply depressed or just emotionally overwhelmed by this transition to adulthood. They're really so sensitive. I mean, what a great group of people to work with. It really always has been. And I love these colleagues, even if I've only met them at a distance.
Neat how you can forge that connection with them. And I appreciate that approach to interacting with your high school age, your teenage students.
And also, of course, just the joy of when you're with like 6-year-olds, you suddenly remember what it's like to be 6. And when you're with 17-year-olds, you suddenly remember what it's like to be that age, and it's nice to sort of access that part of yourself. And it's good that they have this Kolbe background. I know that there was a question about time, and I want to say physics yesterday because that's the most likely one to be. We would have been talking about it, and the kids are right there, with all sorts of references to, movies or like Back to the Future, but also philosophic ideas of time. There's brief digression into, that's, you're reading along the Confessions, you think you're going to get his life story, and suddenly he starts talking about time. What's this all about? But it's actually the key, to what's going, because it's what we all have in common. And I think when they're younger, you can always say, look, school comes first. Absolutely. You do your homework, you get it on time. You're trying to build those habits. When they get to be high schoolers, I keep an eye out for people who are routine procrastinators. And I don't have any this year, which is nice. But I certainly, I tell them, look, the IRS is the most feared government agency in the entire world, bar none. Everybody is terrified of the IRS. And yet they will give you a 6-month extension if you ask. So please just ask for an extension if you need one. And I think just getting them into that idea that as long as they take responsibility, there's a little bit of leeway. In our class, other classes may be more, I don't care what you have going on. You need to get your work in on time. Both of those approaches are good. I don't think there's anything wrong with one or the other. And it's just helping them to navigate it. You've got a reasonable reason to be away. I'll accept it. If um, you are somebody who can never get your homework in on time because you're staying up way too late playing video games, that's a totally different issue. You know,
Mhm.
um, so that's one of my on things I tell them every time. You just have to manage it. They have to manage it, I should say. And then we are able to, and that puts them again on that adult footing. As an adult, you work with supervisors, managers, employees as well, where you have to ask with people for things. You have to negotiate a little bit. There's always a little bit of room. And then there's the inevitability that if you ask for too many extensions, well, we're still going to finish the course at the end of the course. So you can't really let yourself fall into a hole. But there's just a little flexibility as they get older. Whereas when they're younger students, you just want them to get their stuff in on time.
It's that getting them to take that ownership of it, to speak up, the
Ownership,
speak up part.
yeah.
Yeah. That is
Yeah.
the tricky business, and for some more than others, I think.
Oh, yes. I remember, early days of adolescence having to talk to a teacher in school. I I would rather fail everything than actually have to talk to somebody. And when we had oral presentations or one-on-one meetings with the teacher about a presentation or work or something, I was just a nervous wreck. And some of them very kindly noticed it and said, "You're very, very tense about this. It's okay." But it takes time, especially in these transition years. The students, if somebody who's a really introverted person at 13 or 14 may well be much more socially adept by the time they're in their 20s. And so you just have to be aware that these there's some times where students are really just not sure of anything, not sure of themselves. And it's an interesting journey, and it's nice to be able to help people when we can.
Yeah. It doesn't always present itself in a straightforward manner. Like, here's what's going on. It comes out
Right,
in a
but you can
very
see
vastly different way.
you can
Yeah.
hear so often in a student's voice who's confident, who's not. Even in when they write their answers down in a chat box, where I try to keep everybody involved. So a lot of times like everybody to answer at once or put in writing. And you can see the students who are always putting a question mark after their answers. It's like
Hmm.
they're just not sure.
Hmm.
Um, and you hear it in their tone of voice when you call on them. I believe in cold calling students. I know that you were saying that you're not great with that, but I actually will just randomize a list to the class and call on them, even if it's two times in a row when you do it randomly. I think that's good for them, kind of keeps them engaged. And I also have the ability to say, look, it's not me. I'm not picking on you. This is just Microsoft Excel has decided you're the next person who's going to speak.
Yep. I see its usefulness. I just am one of those who has a bit of that hesitation in certain subjects where,
Yeah.
yep.
Oh yeah. And that's another thing that you do with students. You want to assure them, and this is a hard one, and it might be even harder uh, in our context to convince them that really answering a chemistry question incorrectly does not make you a bad person. And if you say it in words, they say, well, that's ridiculous. Of course I know that. But so many times in actions, you see the emotions there that they just don't want to get it wrong.
Yeah.
They don't want to be wrong in front of their peers, and maybe they just don't ever want to be wrong. And that's not how science works. It's not how any of this works, actually. Most of us who've lived a little bit of human life discover that sense of always having to get everything right stays with you, but experience shows you're not going to get everything right. So letting, assuring them that they are not, whether it's a mistake in math, a mistake in using a calculator, not understanding a concept, or where it's the kind of thing that we pass on to our amazing, amazing student support services or amazing deans, where actually I can tell that this is an answer you pulled right off the internet, and let's move this along. That it doesn't define who you are, whether it's an intentional or unintentional thing. It's really, they need a little more. If you don't have that confidence that you are bigger than everything that you are doing or have done, um, it makes it makes their own lives a little harder and worse and unrealistic, you know.
Yeah.
Eventually you're going to come to that knowledge, and it's nice to have people who are warm and supportive telling you that really it's okay. And that's one of my favorites, is to be able to say, oh, I got that, I put this in my calculator wrong, oh, my fat little fingers hit the wrong button, oh, I forgot to put times 10 to the fifth, and it seems like such a small error, but look how off my answer is. That it's just not a big deal to get stuff wrong. And yet, no matter how many times we say it, that's not how teenagers feel. They'll go home and be depressed and upset over something they said that was taken the wrong way, or that seemed stupid, or that was a wrong answer in class. And eventually, most people will get over that. And it's, as I said, just kind of nice to be able to support them in that.
Yeah.
There's nobody in the class who's going to be goofier than I am, so don't worry about it.
I know you have your own homeschooling experience yourself, so I'd like to draw upon that for a bit. And
Sure.
teaching science in the home, I think that tends to be somewhat of a sticking point for people considering homeschooling. Like, what about science though? So what do you say to all that?
I think that it depends, again, like it depends on the person, right? If you can tap in to somebody who really wants to play with stuff, you're going to love teaching science at home. When I grew up, as I said, my grandfather had been a chemistry professor. Later, he went into work, doing something for the Allies during World War II. And then he just worked as an independent chemist for himself. And it was great. So I had a fascination with what he did. And I remember often we'd go to a shop that had a little section of cool science toys. And often I would get, like when I was visiting them in the summer, I would get one and I could spend a day or two just really exploring it, and it was fun. Even then, those toys were a little bit downgraded from maybe the chemistry sets of the mid 20th century, where the first thing in the booklet is, hey kids, let's make gunpowder. So, I had access not only to some of the newer stuff, but even some like antique, and now they would definitely be antiques, older chemistry sets like that, from people who were, doctors or scientists and wanted to pass these things that they had loved on to their kids. So I love playing with this stuff, and I think that it's okay to, as a parent, get something and say, okay, we're going to read through the instructions. We're going to see what we can get out of this. But there are things that I don't know anything about that nonetheless we did science projects on. I have far fewer life science skills or hours of study than I do for the physical sciences. This is just, what I know. So when we got into things like, sea creatures and bugs or whatever, I was always happy to find a homeschooling group to do things with, or to arrange an outing. A lot of museums or science centers are always happy to take school groups, and they're usually happy to take homeschooling groups too. So if you have some can make homeschooling friends, that's always great for things like art, science, things where you have a lot of materials and you might want to get a lower cost by doing a lot of things together. And I have enjoyed being a part of a lot of different groups. I did Lego robotics, which is a lower cost investment than the full FIRST robotics robots, and led that with some of my kids and their friends. Later, my other kids got into high school teams of robotics or junior college teams, again with the same program. I actually, there are a bunch of them here, but when we first heard of it, I was teaching at Kolbe, and we started looking at it to see if it was something we could possibly do. Now, there were no Lego robotics then. It was just the high school robotics. And we really had, I think, maybe one high schooler that year and then a couple of middle schoolers. And it wasn't even feasible. Was not based in California. It's spread nationwide now, and it's everywhere. And it's great. It's a wonderful thing. But just keeping your eyes open for group activities is fine. There's certainly it's interesting when you find homeschoolers who are not Catholic homeschoolers. A lot of the activities I did were with people that I would call more, I don't know, sort of old hippie homeschoolers. Like they just wanted out of the system. They didn't want their kids in the system. And it was an interesting experience. I think there's more of that in our Catholic homeschooling groups even than I knew, as well as our certainly a lot of people start with homeschooling just because they either are dissatisfied with what's on offer around them, or they have some positive reason, right? Like maybe they know of a homeschooling program they really, really like. Or have some experience like that. So, of course, having more kids makes it more cost effective to buy something as a kit or as a textbook or whatever. If you plan to use it through, 5 people versus once, that's really different. Some parents might be concerned that they don't know everything, but I've always been happy to say, hey, let's learn this together. I think that might be a really effective way of approaching homeschooling. When my kids were kind of little at the beginning of the year, I would throw out some ideas, who wants to learn about Indians? Who wants to learn about explorers who and I would let them to some degree suggest what they were interested in, but then again, by the suggestions I'm giving them, I'm kind of constructing, well, these are some things might want to learn about more about, like Oregon Trail was a big game, right? You might want to learn more about those explorers. Let's do that. Let's read these books. Let's try these activities. And some of the activities were things like, I don't know, but we'll see what happens. Not feeling like you have to be, the all-knowing, all-powerful Wizard of Oz who has all the answers, but just, this is life. Life is an adventure. We're going to learn some stuff. I have a pretty good grasp of what I want my kids or homeschoolers to know as a part of society, right? But I don't know every detail about everything. And so we especially something like computer programming, even though I played with computers, starting in like 1977 when Radio Shack released a computer languages change all the time. So recently, we did Python together. I'd never done Python, but why not? We'll see how this goes. And I think another point is it's interesting what people will remember and not. One of the pieces of advice, that people always get in life is, well, remember, people won't know what you said, but they'll always remember how they felt when you said it. It's almost trite, but there's a truth there that your homeschooling kids, they may not remember everything you said, every date, every math relationship, but it still goes into making the whole person. it's, I think about my own experience. I think, well, I know how to read, and yet I don't remember learning to read in school. And I know my a lot about math, but there are only a few moments that stand out. Like maybe when we sang the times three song, which was one of my favorites, you know? So I think you have to sort of have an understanding about, I don't mean like you have to have a degree in education or you have to follow a lot of psychological reports about how humans develop. I think you just have to live in and with human beings and realize this is kind of how it works. Like you could, if your brain would actually be overwhelmed if you had that memory every single time that you were reading the word where, if you had to stop and remember learning it, you wouldn't get anywhere. So that your kids may well forget some of the things you taught them. And that's okay because it's not about each specific little thing. It's about making somebody who is interested in learning, who is interested in life, and certainly as a Catholic school, we want to foster above all their relationship with God, and whether it's explicit or implicit, that's a big part of what we do, right? So when we're studying physics or we're studying chemistry, the excitement about what we're learning, whether, I'm not going to say every class or every hour, hey, look at what God has done here, making these beautiful quarks. And we didn't even know they were there. It's like but that understanding that, yeah, life, God's creation is actually more amazing than you could imagine. It's an expression of God's love, and all you need to do is appreciate it, to love it back, to love him back. That's what parents should be looking for in homeschooling. It's not about whether or not they remember every detail about the circulatory system of that frog they dissected. I want them to, at 4, not necessarily remember everything I said. I hope that they have some memory of some of these things, and I hope that it goes in, I hope when they read about scientific discoveries online, they say, oh yeah, I know a little bit about that. Like, oh, interesting. There's a whole dark matter conference coming up today. I've heard of that from physics class. That's great. And then beyond that, the deeper thing is, I think, why we have a Catholic homeschool instead of some random homeschool, right?
Mm-hmm.
That it's not about the stuff or about how you can you can dominate creation or use that. I mean, that you're a better person because you know more than the next guy. It's about how all of this is part of something very beautiful that's a gift.
Mm-hmm.
And don't necessarily get explicit with that all the time, but there are some Easter eggs throughout the course that eventually, I do remind them that is what it's all about. But it takes a while till later in the year when I can say, remember, we did this and this and this. Remember all those things that were said? This is where it was going. That yes, it's important, but the whole point of doing the science, and don't tell them, because I don't want them to know too early, although they may have already guessed. Is that the whole point? Is why do you bother learning science? 2 reasons, 2 very simple and profound reasons. You want to love God and love your neighbor, and that's exactly what this kind of science and technology goes into. You can misuse technology or you can use it to help people. You can be indifferent to creation or you can appreciate it. And so eventually, toward the end of the year, we talk about that a little, but there's a lot that goes into it. So I'm not sure that I've actually answered your question about what homeschoolers should know, but again, I would say be willing to try something you know nothing about. One year we just start on hieroglyphics, Egyptian hieroglyphics. And it was interesting. We went through a book together and I was like totally upfront with my kids. I've never studied Egyptian hieroglyphics, but let's see what we can learn. And so we did. And I don't think any of them would even look at it and say, "Oh yeah, I remember that little guy," But it's part of sort of like preparing your mind, your soil in your heart and mind for something else,
Yeah.
you know. And of course, you know, it's who you are. It's part of our history as humans. So
Yep. Beautiful. I was looking forward to this conversation. It's gone even better. It's been such a pleasure visiting with you. And I hope it is the first of many conversations. Stephen, before we go, is there anything that you'd like to ask Mrs. Spencer or leave before we go?
Yeah, there was a lot of great themes even that were going through there. The wonder, those common themes, even going back to the Holy Spirit prayer, and that it reminded me of my TAC experience because we started every class with the same prayer to the Holy Spirit, but now every single TAC graduate, says that as soon as you start it, we can all jump in together, or even just like the reading of these great classic works, we kind of join in all of Western civilization together with a common knowledge and a common experience by doing that. But then appreciating the new. So I just loved all of it. It was good. I was just having a great time hearing your stories.
well, thanks for having me. And if you're want to leave some final last words for any parents who are homeschooling, as I think the same thing I would say to my students, we just have to not be afraid of making mistakes because we will. But that's sort of the nature of things. And I, hope you just do your best or what you can do. And you'd be surprised at how much you can do. I would never have even considered it because I had never heard of homeschooling till I started teaching at Kolbe. But after that, I was sure, wow, of course I want to share this with my kids. Of course.
Yeah. Beautiful. All right. This has been such a joy conversing with you today. Our show notes, as usual, have a long list of links that are relevant to our conversation today. So listeners, we encourage you to head there, check those out, and to join the conversation with us here. Mrs. Spencer, thank you so much again for coming to visit with us, and come back soon, please.
Oh, thank you.
Subscribe to the Kolbecast on your favorite podcast app so that you don't miss an episode. And let us know how we're doing by leaving a rating or a review. And as always, feel free to email us at podcast@kolbe.org.
Mary, our Mother, pray for us. St. Maximilian Kolbe, St. Ignatius of Loyola, holy saints and angels, pray for us. Ad maiorem Dei gloriam.